Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, once again. My name is Darren Mitchell, Vice President of the Battle for Australia Association New South Wales branch. Welcome to you all today. We're grateful to see so many faces here on a Monday morning, and particularly as we recount the experience of Australians during a very, very difficult time in our history during 1942 to 1945. And particularly, if I might just welcome, as we begin, our guest speaker today, Mr. Peter FitzSimons. We're grateful for your willingness to share with us your great insight into Australia's military history and Australian history generally, and a great storyteller to come. A member unable to join us today is Harry Eales, who traditionally shares an acknowledgement of country as we begin our proceedings. And he's asked me to share his words with you today in his absence. So I now read what would have been Mr. Eales' acknowledgement of country. We gather today on land that is sacred to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians whose ancestors nurtured it through deep time. We gather more than 80 years since those momentous days of 1942, which initiated critical air, land and sea battles around Australia and our region in defence of our nation. Many Indigenous people have proudly served in Australian uniform and been welcomed with dignity into service within our Defence Forces. Together, we can all take pride in the courage of those who have served over time and in the culture of our forebears. And today we acknowledge that heritage with gratitude for its gifts to us all, placing hope in its legacy and remembering the sacrifices that have made it possible, lest we forget. And it's our great pleasure that Mr. Peter FitzSimons, AM, has agreed to give the 2025 oration for the Battle for Australia. May I just say a few words of introduction? When we were meeting as a committee and the suggestion of Peter came up, and he was phoned, it took him less than a few seconds to say yes, and we're most delighted that you would agree so readily to be a member of our occasion today. You would all know that Peter FitzSimons is a prolific author and renowned journalist. Hopefully you've read his most recent contributions in the Sydney Morning Herald, Saturday and Thursday last week, inveterate reporter on all things sport and its culture. But among his many book titles, some of which you can see at the back there, and we'll have some more to say about that later, but among his many titles in Australian history are the best-selling Kokoda, acclaimed by one critic as an engrossing narrative by a master storyteller, and the most recent release, The Legend of Albert Jacka, the biography of the iconic First World War Victoria Cross recipient. And I hope that you may have already purchased that for yourself or a friend for Christmas, because it was out just in time for the Christmas sales. So as you can hear, legendary battles and legendary figures of Australian history have been Peter's métier as he's communicated to us in so many ways, particularly as a storyteller of our history. Peter also played a key role in our nation's preparations for the centenary of the First World War, advising the Commonwealth Government on its commemorative program back between 2014 and 2018. And Peter has been named a member of the Order of Australia in 2011 for service to literature as a biographer, sports journalist, commentator, and to the community through contributions to conservation, disability care, social welfare and sporting organisations, and I'm sure that does not exhaust the list of contributions. So Peter, we are very eager to hear from you today as you bring to us the Battle for Australia oration for 2025.
Okay, so thank you, Darren. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm honoured to be here. I do hope I can do justice to the occasion, and I'm aware of the significance of the occasion. You'll excuse me for being without a coat. I was encouraged by how many of you are in shirts without ties, and it's a bit warm. So I begin by noting I am not an academic. I note you've had many serious historians making this oration before, nor am I an officer of the Australian Forces, nor am I a veteran. I am none of those things. I love stories. I love particularly Australian stories, and I suppose to bolster my credentials to make my remarks today, I particularly invoke The names of my parents, Lieutenant Peter McCloy FitzSimons and Lieutenant Beatrice Helen Booth, both of whom served in the Second World War, as did my father's twin brother James FitzSimons, who was in the latter stages of the Battle of Kokoda, and my grandfather, Trooper Frederick Harper Booth, who served in the Boer War with the 4th Victorian Mounted Rifles. And my family's particularly honoured if you go, when you see that Boer War Memorial down at Canberra, just down from the War Memorial out on the right, if you approach that magnificent bronze statue, there in front on the plinth is the letter from a trooper written to his mother, Mariah Sophia Craigie McPherson Dunbull, and that's my grandfather writing to my great-grandmother, on that Boer War Memorial of his experiences in the Boer War. So Australian sort of military history is in my bones. I grew up as the youngest of Peter FitzSimons and Helen Booth, came back from the war and had a farm up at Pete's Ridge, 60 acres. They grew oranges, lemons, tomatoes and children. I was the youngest and longest of those children. I set a record at the Sand Hospital when I was born at 25 and a half inches. Mum said I was so long when I was born that I was born on the 27th, the 28th and the 29th of June. And I wouldn't say that my life early on was filled with war stories, because they weren't particularly those kind of people. But the war was sort of around, and I suppose the visitors' mum and dad's friends were veterans from that Second World War. And like my brothers and sisters, every Anzac Day we went up to Mangrove Mountain RSL, and Dad would sometimes come down and march. But I think I've done 30 odd books, and I suppose half of them have been war books. And if I'm a critic, I love Australia's history. I am so proud of Australia's military history. I think there's always a tendency to be vainglorious in particular countries, to say our soldiers were special, our soldiers were extraordinary. But honestly, if you look at it, our soldiers, our men and women, our aviators, our naval people, we've pretty much always been on the right side of the battle, and they have performed magnificently well. If I was to form a criticism, however, it is this. If we as Australians, we 26 million of us, were to form up all of our knowledge of our military history and put it in a big pile, I put it to you that 95% of our collective knowledge would start at dawn on the 25th of April 1915, and it would fade by sundown. Because we tell that story, and it's a great story. What happened at Gallipoli is an extraordinary achievement. I've been there a couple of times. I first went there as a young rugby player living in Italy, and I went through the Iron Curtain, and it took me 3 days to get through the communist countries, and I woke up in a hostel in Istanbul, and I looked out the window and there was a man walking a bear, and I thought, I'm home, this is my kind of place. And I went down to Gallipoli, and when you see what was achieved there, and then I've written a book about it, it is no doubt about it extraordinary. But there is so much more of our history, of which the battle for Australia forms a great part. And I want to take a Dennis Lilly run-up to talking about it, if I may. In the course of the books that I've done, the people I've been privileged to talk to, the people I've come to know, the veterans, I suppose I've been attracted by three things. Great feats of daring-do, military daring-do. If you look at what was accomplished at Gallipoli, if you look at what happened at Villers-Bretonneux, if you look at people like Albert Jacka, what they did, John Monash, the great, not unsung hero, but not sung as much as he should be, General Sir John Monash, Long Tan, Kokoda, Tobruk. They are extraordinary stories. I also love, when I'm doing the stuff, quintessentially Australian stories. There was an English law lord in 1796 who said, I do not know how to define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. I feel the same about Australianness. I do not know how to define it, but my breath shortens, my pulse quickens when I see it. And it's been, as I say, a pleasure and a privilege to write about it. I've also loved the process through war, where Australians developed our own identity as Australians, not merely transplanted Brits beneath the Southern Cross, but Australians taking pride in ourselves, what we've been able to achieve, what we are capable of when we all pull together, and the growing understanding that our interests really are different from our one-time colonial masters, the Brits. And I must say, it was this process of evolution of our identity. It's natural enough, but I think it's wonderful to focus on how far we've come. I thought, if I may say, to take this particular spot at the Royal Automobile Club, this magnificent building on Macquarie Street. I love the story of Eddie Trickett. So Eddie Trickett, this is not military, but I love it and I can't resist telling it. I think it was 1872, in the 1870s, there was basically a Formula One of single scull rowing out on Sydney Harbour. Eddie Trickett won. He was the best that Sydney had ever produced. He was the son of a convict. They sent him over to Britain to take on Joseph Henry Sadler, the King of the Thames, and he beat him. And when the news came through that he'd beat him, the Sydney Morning Herald, my newspaper, completely outdid itself. It was simply extraordinary that a son of the Southern Cross of this colony could go and beat a Brit. And he had married the daughter of the lighthouse keeper at South Head. And when his ship was off the coast, the lighthouse keeper flashed, he's coming. 25,000 people down there at Circular Quay, waiting with carriages with 6 horses, and they greeted him. They let the horses go, they pulled him up Pitt Street, and they partied through the night at Punch Hotel. Just part of the evolution of, we're not transplanted Brits and we're as good as they are and we can beat them. Over there where the Museum of Contemporary Art is, we all know because we talk about it the 26th of January every year. Philip hauls up the flag and absurdly claims Australia on behalf of Britain, and here we are in such a conservative institution as that, and Darren read out a wonderful welcome to country to acknowledge that it is not a British country, we're our own people, and we acknowledge the people of the First Nations that were here and will be here and stay here. So in this process of evolution, for me, of self-identity, the battle for Australia is of course the standout battle in that field in all 3 of the above. But what interests me most, more than as much as the battle itself, is that lead up to it. That going into the First World War, the man who would become Prime Minister, Andrew Fisher, famously said, "This country will fight for Great Britain to the last man and the last shilling." An extraordinary statement, but emblematic of the times, because even then we regarded ourselves as the loyal sons and daughters of Great Britain. 25 years later, on the eve of New Year's Eve 1941 going into 42, the great John Curtin said, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." There was a huge outcry at this, none more so than Winston Churchill, that he should say such a thing, but I'll get to that. So my particular interest has been what led to this extraordinary evolution/revolution in the Australian approach. And it really did start with Gallipoli. And every now and then I use a lot of researchers, and so all kinds of stuff is flowing into my laptop. And I come across these things that again make my pulse race, sometimes in anger, sometimes in inspiration. I've never been as moved, I think, /appalled by the beginnings, finding out the beginnings of where Gallipoli came from. The 13th of January 1915 at 10 Downing Street, there is a meeting of the War Council. The First World War has of course broken out. It's been going for about 6 months, 5 or 6 months. And for the first time, that First World War saw industrialised nations going up against each other with guns that could fire 600 bullets a minute. And the Germans, by the end of that war, had developed the gun, the Paris gun, that could fire a shell 125 kilometres, 80 miles. The result was absolute carnage on the Western Front, where the German forces came up against the French, came up against the Brits. The only way to survive was to dig. The only way to outflank was to dig out to the right. You end up with the Western Front 100 yards between them, and the slaughter is shocking. And by the 13th of January 1915, the Brits had lost 18,500 soldiers killed, and the meeting there is Lord Asquith, the British Prime Minister, is at the top of the table, and they're going through the papers, the reports. What are we going to do? The head of the British Army wants another 50,000 soldiers to be put in uniform. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, he makes the proposal. The proposal is, we'll invade the Dardanelles. Essentially, his idea is that the Royal Navy has not suffered a defeat in 100 years. The Ottoman Empire hasn't had a win in 100 years, so against us. So we'll put the two together. We will send the ships up the Dardanelles, and we'll wave. I think the phrase was, "We'll wave the Union Jack 3 times, and they'll all give up." Well, they didn't. But that afternoon, from that table, the British Prime Minister wrote, 62-year-old Leonine Asquith, Herbert Asquith, writes to his 27-year-old presumed lover. Now, no shame in having a 27-year-old lover, even though he was married. None of my damn business, that part of it. But he writes to his lover, to Venetia Stanley, the 27-year-old aristocrat, from that table, "My dearest darling Venetia, Winston has come up with the most wonderful plan to invade the Dardanelles," and this is the part that I directly quote, "I'm keen to tell you all about it and see if it meets with your approval." What? 9,000 Australians died in that campaign. 35,000 Brits. I think it was 180,000 Turks. New Zealanders, 3,000. It was a disaster. Despite how well the New Zealanders and the Australians and the Brits fought in that campaign, and the Turks, it was a disaster. But that was at a time where it was quite permissible for the Brits to decide what would the Australians do. No consultation with the Australians about what was going to happen. The first one to hear about it outside of that room was a 27-year-old aristocrat who was the lover of the British Prime Minister. And yet, despite those beginnings, the Australians and the New Zealanders, I mentioned, I'm going back to the New Zealanders because I know we've got the new consul here, Mr. Munro, but they also did magnificently well. Despite that, they fought with great passion, and I love the lines from the great Australian war historian, C.W. Bean, Charles Bean. He'd written that a typical soldier was, quote, "a bushman in disguise. And if the wild pastoral life of Australia makes rather wild men, it makes a superb soldier." And that proved to be the truth. It can be overdone that we were wild colonial boys and did it all, because there are a lot of urban people too. But broadly, they did extraordinarily well. And I have written about Albert Jacka, and he was the exemplar of a soldier that was more anonymous than a lost dog at the time that he left, and yet performed so extraordinarily well under those conditions that he came back the most famous man in Australia, and he was awarded his VC for the actions on the night of the 19th to the 20th of May 1915. The Turks, with extraordinary courage, extraordinary valour, they lined up 40,000 of them and they sent them straight at the Australian trenches, and the idea being to break through, and at 3 o'clock in the morning they did break through. They got into the trenches. It was Jacka who took the matters into his own hands. He grabbed two blokes from Bendigo that he knew. He said, "In 30 seconds I want you to lob those grenades over into the trench where the Turks are. I'm going to go rush along this trench, come at them from the different angle, and do as I say. Got it, get it, go." He does it, they lob, the first grenade misses, the second grenade lands, Jacka jumps in, everything goes quiet after a huge battle. The lieutenant puts his head round the corner, and there is Albert Jacka, leaned up against 7 brave Turks that he'd killed, and with a cigarette out the side of his mouth, and said, "Well, I got the bastard, sir." And for that he was awarded the VC, and I may go on about it a little later, but He should have, in my, Bean thought he should have got 3 VCs, I reckon he should have got 4. Obviously I defer to Bean. But the one that again absolutely enraged me and helped forge the Australian identity, the idea that we're our own people, not transplanted Brits, happened on the morning in the early hours of the 7th of August 1915, the Battle of the Neck. And it should be better known than it is, but Peter Weir immortalised it in his film Gallipoli, which came out in the 1980s. The plan was formed by 2 British generals, Sir Alexander Godley and Sir William Birdwood. And here's the plan. We're going to be in our trench. The Turks are going to be 50 yards yonder at the end of a narrow strip of land. And you've all got your guns, but no bullets in them, just bayonets. You're going to have to charge. You're all going to have to charge that 50 yards. From 4 a.m. to 4:30 a.m., the British warships down in the sea will lob them on the Turkish noggins, and it'll stop at 4:30. The whistle will blow. We'll have 4 blasts, 2 minutes apart. 4 waves will go at them. So they're there. The bombardment starts. The Turks go down into their trenches with very little damage done. At 4:23 a.m, suddenly the barrage stops. The Turks realise something's coming, so they get their guns up and they just trail along the top of the Australian trenches to test their guns, to get their range right. And at 4:30 a.m, the whistle blows. The first wave of Australian soldiers, they were from the 10th Light Horse and the 8th Australian Light Horse, they go over the top, and the eyewitnesses said it was as if their legs were made of spaghetti as they tumbled back down into the trench. The second, 2 minutes later, the second whistle blows. Before the third whistle, there is a pause as they're trying to work out whether to go or not. The word comes back, yes, you're going to go. The Turks in the sepulchral silence shout to the Australians behind the Turkish machine guns, shout to the Australians, duh, 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 don't. For God's sake, do not keep coming onto our guns. One digger famously shook the hands of the man next to him and said, goodbye, Cobber, and God bless you. The whistle goes, over they go. Half of the 4th wave were able to be stopped, but by the end of that battle, and it went no more than 15 minutes, we had 200 dead Australians and we had as many casualties. And it was because of such insane battle plans that the idea began ever more to take hold. Maybe we know better than the commanders, than the Brits, how to do this. And nobody felt that stronger than Albert Jacka, VC. So when he got back to Cairo, Jacka applied to join officers' training school. He was blocked fundamentally by the British overmasters, and it was John Monash who stepped up, General Sir John, he wasn't knighted by that point, but General John Monash, who told the Brits, it may be the way you Australians do it, it's not the way we do it. He will make a fine officer. The British view was, basically, we're only looking for officers and gentlemen. Jacka left school at the age of 13. He's not the kind of person we're looking for. Jacka, at Monash's behest, and John Monash's push behind him, joined the officers' training school, and he came second in a class of 20 with an average of 94% because he understood how the battle should go. He joins, then the Australians go to the Western Front. And again, if I get teary late at night doing this stuff, when you read the accounts of what the Western Front was like, the horror, the absolute horror as the Australians march forward. Darren mentioned the Australian Centenary Committee that I was a part of, working out how to commemorate that great war. And we, at one point, we gained the services of Professor Bruce Skates, a very eminent, wonderful military historian from Monash University. And the idea was we want 100 stories of Australians in the Great War that is emblematic, that are emblematic of the Australian experience in that war. Bruce Gates came up to Canberra. We all met in Canberra for the first 20 that he'd assembled. And the lights go down, the PowerPoint presentation comes up, the videos roll, and we hear the first 20 stories, each one more appalling than the last, of wonderful people that had died shocking deaths and come back with terrible injuries, suffered great trauma that went through the generations. The lights come up, and it's my dear friend Deborah Thomas, who was then the editor of the Australian Women's Weekly, who asked, not unreasonably, did anything good happen in that Great War? And Professor Skates wonderfully said no. And if you try to turn this into a hallmark greeting card of wonderful things that happened, I'll resign. This was a terrible war, huge trauma. We lost 62,000 Australians that were killed in that war, and that has to be commemorated and that has to be understood. And nowhere as this evolutionary feeling of we're our own people and we need to have our own commanders is better exemplified than what happened at the Battle of Fromelles. Just about unknown in this country. Just about unknown. But there was. There was a brilliant piece written in the Herald last Anzac Day. Matter of fact, I wrote it. And the theme of it was, we Australians, we have, every Anzac Day, every 11th of November, we have, and rightly so, we have remembrance, we have reverence, and we have respect. There's one arm missing. We don't have rage. There are many things to look back on our history where we should have rage, and nowhere more than the Battle of Fromelles, which happened on the 19th of July, 1916. In the lead up to it, the orders came through, and the great Great Australian General, Pompey Elliott, seized the orders. And the orders are for 7,000 Australian soldiers to charge in broad daylight, 400 yards across swampy ground at a German bunker called the Sugarloaf, bristling with these machine guns, firing 600 bullets a minute. Pompey Elliott gets the British Major, his name was Major Howard, from British General Headquarters, takes him to the spot, says to him, "What do you think will happen to my men if I give them these orders and they charge at those guns?" Major Howard said, I don't like to talk like that. I don't like this kind of conversation. Pompey Elliott said, "I'm asking you, what do you think will happen?" Major Howard said, well, and these were his words, "Well, if you ask me, I think it'll be a bloody Holocaust." Holocaust obviously being a word then that meant not what it meant after the Second World War. It'll be a bloody Holocaust. Pompey Elliott says, well, get those orders changed. Those orders weren't changed. As our diggers are in those trenches, about to go and charge across that ground, the Germans are practising their machine gun fire. It was said that if you threw a helmet up, it would be blown back by the fusillade of bullets. The whistle blows. Over they go. In the next 14 hours, of the 7,000 Australian soldiers that went forward, 1,850 of them were killed, stone, motherless, dead. 5,500 went down, 1,850 killed. And when I roll those figures off, it is appalling. But reduce that 1,850, go down a bit further, 1,850 times across the country. Knock on the door on 1,850 households in a place that held, in a country of 5 million, to open the door to see the telegram boy with the pink telegram saying, "We regret to inform you that your son, John Forsyth Briggs, NX 19454, has been killed in the Battle of Fromelles. The King sends his respects and deepest grief at your bereavement." The horror of that. After that, a few days later, you had the Battle of a week or two later, that was the 19th of July, so ending July, going into the Battle of Pozieres was underway, and into August the Battle of Pozieres takes place. And in that instance, the Australians, basically in 6 weeks, we lose 6,000 Australians. Albert Jacka was involved in that one, and again, what he accomplished in that battle, being called the most audacious individual act of that First World War. But on the basis of this, on the basis of the Australians performing so well, and the growing realisation that the British commanders did not have the Australian interests at heart, I wrote much of this speech at 3 a.m. and I came across a quote from Monash writing to his wife saying at some point the British are going to have to explain why the Australian casualties and deaths are so high. But because the Australians continued to perform so wonderfully well in that on the Western Front, among the finest soldiers there, the idea took hold in Australia, seeing as they're Australians, fighting for Australia, on behalf of Australia, in the Australian Army, what do you think, maybe we should have an Australian in charge? Call them crazy. But what about we get Sir John Monash to be the general, to take a different approach, to look after Australians and form up orders formed for Australians? To you and me, it may seem absolutely straightforward that, well, of course you'd get an accomplished general like Monash to take over, but there was an outcry at the time. The very idea that an Australian general could be stronger and better than an English general was absolutely staggering to many. And I know this is a very smart audience and a very accomplished audience, but to this day, this is the truth, to this day, as late as 2025, there are still Australians among us who take the same view according to our constitutional arrangements. There are people that think that we need to have a British head of state. No, truly. Truly there are. There are those who think we can't have an Australian as our own head of state. We still have to be linked to an aristocratic family living in a palace in London. I know, it's amazing. I let the record show there was a certain stunned silence, and only a few people up the front dared titter. A few others looked down at their shoes. But the orator moved on the best he could. Monash took over, and everything changed. Everything changed. You had an Australian in charge, he was an engineer, and he formed up new plans. No longer are we going to have thousands of Australian soldiers charging at guns, and if they've got 5,000 and we kill 3,000 but lose 2,000, etc., etc. We're not going to do it like that. We're going to look at the weakest point in their defences. We will maximise our own force at the weakest point. We'll break through there. He forms up the most wonderfully, highly calibrated plan for the opening battle of his generalship, or as commander of the Australian Defence Forces, the Battle of Hamel, on the 4th of July. In the early hours of the 4th of July, they attacked at 3:08 a.m. Why 3:08 a.m? Because Monash had worked it out that the Australians will be attacking from the west with the Americans, with the Germans in the east, that as the sun comes up, the defenders will be silhouetted by the rising sun. The Australians and Americans will be attacking from the darkness, and once they break through, they're not going to be like an uncoiled spring that goes as far as it can till they run out of steam and then have to pull back. They'll go to an exact point. They will put out sheets so that the planes that are overhead can drop fresh supplies to them. It was an absolute triumph. Instead of doing what was done at Pozieres, where basically every yard gained was gained at the expense of 10 dead soldiers, they gained 1.5 miles. They only lost 300 Australians, and it was a breakthrough in the whole way that war could be done and won. So much so that the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, says, I want to see these men. He travels from Paris on the news of the victory. He goes to Hamel. They get the 4th Brigade of the Australians, and Monash was there out of the trenches. And Clemenceau, again, if I could get Australian school children, there's a few things I'd love them to learn. But Clemenceau, who spoke English, says to these battered, tattered diggers that have come from the trenches, who just had this great victory, he says to them, we knew you would fight a real fight. But we did not know that from the beginning you would astonish the continent with your valour. I have come here for the simple purpose of seeing the Australians and telling them this. I shall go back tomorrow and say to my countrymen, I have seen the Australians. I have looked into their eyes. I know that they, men who have fought great battles in the cause of freedom, will fight alongside us till the freedom for which we are all fighting is guaranteed for us and our children. And I just think that's one of the most magnificent speeches where, and among the first time that sort of internationally, globally, the Australians are recognised for their valour, as they were at Villers-Bretonneux. Many of you will have been to Villers-Bretonneux, the two battles of Villers-Bretonneux, and the Australians saved the town and basically helped prevent an absolute disaster that would have taken place had the Germans been able to hold on to it. When you go to Villers-Bretonneux, many of you will have been to the schoolhouse there, and over the gates it says "N'oublions jamais l'Australie," never forget Australia. Above every blackboard it says exactly the same, never forget Australia. And I cherish the story in 2011. And so what happened was the Australians saved the town, they come back, and it was the Victorian soldiers particularly, I think it was a penny, bring a penny for Villers-Bretonneux, the school children bring their pennies, and they raised money to build that schoolhouse, which is why they're so fondly remembered. And the Victorian bushfires, Black Friday in 2011, the little town of Strathewen in regional Victoria burnt down, and 2 days later, when the embers had started to no longer glow and burn, the principal was walking through the shattered remains, the ashen remains of her schoolhouse, and the phone rang, and a voice said, "Vous êtes le principal de Strathewen, l'école de Strathewen?" She says, "Yes." "Je suis le maire de Villers-Bretonneux." "I am the mayor of Villers-Bretonneux. We would like to make a donation to your school." And they sent the money, and they built a particular courtyard and garden in Strathewen, sort of in memory of what had happened at Villers-Bretonneux 100 years later, the bonds that still existed between them. 2 years later, a big shiny bus pulls up at the newly built schoolhouse of Strathewen, and the doors open, and out get 30 citizens of Villers-Bretonneux, and the 30 school children of Strathewen Public said, "Ready, children? Now, allons les enfants de patrie, à le jour de gloire est arrivé." Each child takes one of the citizens of Villers-Bretonneux into the house. They have pumpkin scones, Anzac biscuits, lashings of orange juice, and I said to the principal when I interviewed her in 2017, "How long did this go on for?" And she said, "It's still going on." And those are the stories from that great war that have particularly moved me. And at the end of it, and so the point for me of that great war, two things. That Australians had performed wonderfully well, but they were jack of useless slaughter following the orders of others. And at the Palace of Versailles, when they had the Versailles Treaty meetings in 2019, we had the little digger, Billy Hughes was our Prime Minister, and at one point an issue of contention was New Guinea. Who should control, who should take over the territory of New Guinea? Should it be the Japanese, who had served on our side and served with the Allies in the First World War, or should it be the Australians? And Billy Hughes and Woodrow Wilson had a furious argument over it, and at one point Woodrow Wilson, the American president, tried to belittle Hughes by saying, well, it should be the Japanese, saying, "After all, you speak, Mr. Australian Prime Minister, for only 5 million people." Billy Hughes corrected him. "No, Mr. President," he said, "I speak for 60,000 dead Australians, and we will be heard in this forum," and so they were, and so they should have been. And Paul Keating, the issue is, did the Australians in that Great War, did they die in vain? I was privileged to be present at the tomb when Paul Keating made the famous speech in 2013, commemorating 20 years since the tomb of the unknown soldier. And Keating said, "In honouring our war dead, said they haven't died in vain. Keating said, in honouring our war, Mr. Keating said, in honouring our war dead, as we always have, we declare that this is not true. Square bracket, they didn't die in vain. For out of the war came a lesson which transcended the horror and tragedy and the inexcusable folly. It was a lesson about ordinary people, and the lesson was that they were not ordinary. On all sides, they were the heroes of that war. Not the generals and the politicians, but the soldiers and sailors and nurses. Those who taught us to endure hardship, show courage, to be bold as well as resilient, to believe in ourselves, to stick together. That was the lesson out of that First World War. And yet going into the Second World War, when it broke out, our Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, the famous lines, delivered the famous lines announcing that Australia was at war. Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that, as a result, Australia is also at war. And I had always felt that had been a moral imperative that Menzies was saying, that as a result, Great Britain's at war, we're at war too. Malcolm Turnbull is of the view that that was a legal imperative, and I've written about this in the Herald too, that the view of the Australian Prime Minister going into that Second World War was Great Britain's at war, well, we're still the sons and daughters of Great Britain, well, we're at war too. And so we enter that war, and Australians go into the first real battle, certainly the first big battle that I wrote about, and again it stunned me what happened. The Battle of Tobruk. You know, amazing that the Germans had rolled all the way through Europe, knocked over Poland, knocked over Belgium, knocked over France, every army they came to, and then they go into North Africa and they knock them over until they get to the Australians, who man the perimeter of Tobruk with the British artillery inside. And the Australians perform again, and as did the Brits with the artillery, and the Indians that were there too. But the Australians, under the command of General Morshead, who famously said, Britain, the Times in London, when the word first came back that the Australians had held the day and forced the forces of General Rommel back, the Africa Corps, the Times of London said, Tobruk can take it. And Morshead got a copy of it, slammed it down in front of his officers and said, we're not here to take it, we are here to give it. And give it they did, and over the next 8 months they had serious battles against the Germans 4 times, and they had four victories. And again, if I could wonder if Australian school children could learn one bit of prose that I would advocate. It was written by the great ABC war correspondent Chester Wilmot, and he wrote these words: "The spirit which has made Australia is the spirit which has held Tobruk. The inspiring and binding force in Australian life isn't tradition or nationalism or social revolution. It's quite a simple thing. Henry Lawson called it mateship, the spirit which makes men stick together. In Australia, by sticking together, men have defied drought, bushfire and flood. In Tobruk, they've scorned hardship, danger and death, because no digger would ever let his cobbers down. In Tobruk, for the first time in this war, the Germans were thrust back by a spirit that even tanks and dive bombers could not conquer." For me, that encapsulates the essence of the glory of what happened at Tobruk and what happened in the battle for Australia, of Australians sticking together, and I'll get to Kokoda shortly. But before going, I just want to focus on one other story that I think has been lost, certainly, from public recognition of what happened. And that was the 6th Division rolls through North Africa, sweeping all before it. I mean, my uncle Ted Carter, Lieutenant Edward Gordon Carter, was in the 2nd 1st Pioneers, and I think it was the 21st of January 1941 they get to Tobruk, and it's just before dawn that the order is given, and it's not, B Company go left, C Company go right. The Sergeant Major roars out, "Go, you bastards!" And go they did. They used these things called Bangalore torpedoes to break down, to shoot through the barbed wire. They rush into Tobruk. I think the battle goes for 2 or 3 days. Cairo sends a cable and says, how many Italian prisoners are there? And they sent back a cable, 20 acres, which was the best that they could do. And after that, so then the job for them is to hold Tobruk. But it was at the behest of Winston Churchill, and I've been writing about this. I'm not going to hijack this occasion and beg you to read my books. I don't care. I don't care if you do or don't read my books. All I care is that you buy my books. But I've just last week I was up at the Thai-Burma Railway finishing my book on the great, God help me, the great Weary Dunlop. What an extraordinary Australian he was. But going to that, I've lost my train of thought, and sometimes I just go, it'll come back to me. I'm going from dot points rather than a written speech. But in the Greek campaign, Weary Dunlop was a part of the Greek campaign, and Churchill, basically what happened, it is again staggering. The Germans, March and April of 1941, the Germans had 27 divisions. I think it came to 650,000 German soldiers with Panzer tanks pouring through the northern border. Britain had a treaty with them, had a treaty with Greece to say, you're attacked, we attack, we'll look after each other. Who were the ones that went in? It was called Luster Force. It was the 6th Division. I think we had 50,000 men total. We had 20,000, 25,000 with the New Zealanders and some Brits. But how could it be anything other than what it was? An absolute debacle. The 6th Division was sacrificed to those insane orders, and despite the heroism of the Australians, there's a wonderful line from, I think he was named General Bloody George Vasey, because of a quote that he said, he gave to the Australian soldiers, "Here we bloody well are, and here we bloody well stay." And they fought like tigers. In the end, the 6th Division was evacuated to Crete. They lost a lot of men. I think we lost 3,000 killed. And so there is the situation. In 1941, the Australians have done fantastically well at Tobruk and in Syria. Curtin has taken over from Menzies after the debacle of what happened in Greece. And Curtin wants the Australians of Tobruk and Syria to come home. Churchill wants them to stay there to the end. Curtin can see what's coming with Japan and insists that they come home. And in my view, not as an historian, I don't claim to be an historian. I sometimes get mocked for saying once that I'm a historian, but I'm in it for the story and I love the story of it. I don't care. The story is extraordinary. And the most underdone story of the lot is the interaction between John Curtin and Churchill about the Australian soldiers coming back from North Africa. So what happens is the Japanese, we all know, the 7th of December 1941, the bombs are dropped on Pearl Harbor by the Americans, and Curtin does not wait for Britain, he doesn't wait for America, he declares war on Japan immediately. He was awoken in his hotel room at 5 a.m. in Melbourne, and he said, and so it has come. And from that point on, the 8th Division, all eyes turned to Singapore. Curtin wanted more resources, more troops, more ships put into Singapore. Churchill assured him that it was safe. The 8th Division, our 8th Division, was there. All but in its entirety, and again, just because I've been writing about it in the last few days and it makes me weep, again, it's been lost to Australian history, but the massacre at Parat Soulong, and that was the Australians of the 8th Division, particularly the 2nd 29th Battalion, fought this extraordinary battle against the overwhelming forces of the Japanese coming down the Malay Peninsula, getting closer and closer to Singapore, and on the 21st of January 1942, there they are. They've been able to hold them up for 4 or 5 days. The Japanese finally overwhelmed them. There was 110 Australians. There was 40 brave Indian soldiers. They made them strip naked apart from their boots and their socks. and I won't go, it's too grisly and too horrible, but we lost 108 Australians, 40 Indians, and I think, I haven't finished this part yet, but I've been going through the extraordinary account of one of the survivors. I think we only had a handful of survivors, if that. But so then all eyes turned to Singapore. The 15th of February 1942, the Singapore falls. Churchill has sent any number of magnificent telegrams about fight to the last man and make us proud and all of this stuff. In the end, the British commanders, not unreasonably, decided they'd rather live than have everybody slaughtered. The 8th Division is our own 8th Division is captured, and it's a devastating blow for Australia, seeking to, the Japanese are coming closer to Australia. We've just lost the 8th Division, and there John Curtin, as Darren said, gave these wonderful words, these potent words: just as Dunkirk began the battle for Britain, so does Singapore open the battle for Australia. It is now work or fight, as we have never worked or fought before. On what we do now depends everything we hope to do when this bloody test has been survived. So here we are in Sydney. We're all over the Australian east coast. We're aware that the Japanese are coming closer, and to our shocked and stunned amazement, the great British citadel of Singapore has fallen, and we're all alone. What's the one thing that gives us solace? Our blokes coming back from North Africa. The bombs start to fall on Darwin on the 19th of February 1942. Things are grim, Jim. As we'd say in the Wallabies, shit's his trumps on the blind. Here they come, and we're all alone for the moment, but the first lot of the 7th Division is coming across, to be followed by the remnants of the 6th Division. We've lost the 8th Division, 9th Division still there but coming. And this is the underdone story. Our ships, our men on British ships, are coming back over the Indian Ocean. Curtin gets a telegram, a cable from Winston Churchill, to say the Japanese are forcing their way to India, which India is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, so they're pressing to the west, towards India, through Burma, and they're coming south towards Australia. Churchill sends a cable to say, I want the Australian soldiers now on the Indian Ocean to go to Burma, now known as Myanmar. Curtin says, no, they're Australians, we need them to come back for Australia. Churchill sends a cable 48 hours later to say, 24 hours ago, I have given the order. And Churchill's view was, I'm the commander, I am the leader of the British Empire, I'm saying that the Australians, as loyal soldiers of the British Empire, will go to Burma. And again, I cannot overstate, even though I'm not an historian, but I look at it and it's all there for everyone to see. The insanity, the outrage of those orders from Churchill to tell the Australian Prime Minister that he has given the orders to divert Australian troops. Think of it as the way Churchill, at this point, the 6th Division, the Australian 6th Division, has been totally sacrificed in Greece on an insane campaign, sent in as the main force of Luster Force against 27 German divisions. So 6th Division, those that get out, they get to Crete. We lose 3,000 soldiers in Crete that are captured. The 7th Division, the first lot of 7th Division, has landed at Java because of a Dutch treaty between the Brits and the Dutch, Weary Dunlop among them. They're all captured. The 8th Division has been taken POWs in Singapore. The 9th Division, Churchill had wanted to keep them in Tobruk and Syria, but he'd had to fight to get them out. And there is this command, really framed as a command from Churchill to the Australian Prime Minister to say, I've given the orders for them to go to Burma. The Japanese were already in Burma. It would have been another Crete. It would have been a slaughter. It would have been an absolute disaster. Curtin is so upset by the cable from Churchill that he walks the hills around Canberra to think about it. And there's been cables from Earl Page, who was the Australian High Commissioner, who'd taken the side of Churchill, saying, no, this is important for the British Empire, it's important for our forces that they go to Burma. Curtin had given the immortal reply, and this is not an exact quote, but it's there, I won't read it, but it basically says, I dare say there are many places in this war where Australian forces will be of great use, but nowhere will they be of such great use as in the defence of Australia. Which, again, irrevocable, no way around it, that logic. So at midnight, Curtin comes back. They've been looking for Curtin, his office has been looking for him. They put up, there's one theatre in Canberra, and they put up a notice saying, if you are the Prime Minister, phone home. And he comes in the early hours and has a cable sent back to Churchill, which an academic described to me once as the Australian version of the Declaration of Independence. Our version of the Declaration of Independence, saying they're Australians, they will come home, and so they did. Despite Churchill explaining to others why Australians were, open quote, so jittery, close quote, Churchill's explanation was, open quote, because the Australians are of bad stock. That's it. That was the quote from Churchill. Bad stock, jittery about the Japanese approaching our shores. And so that was the beginning of the Battle of Australia. The Australian soldiers came back, and my father had fought in the Battle of El Alamein, and my father was among those. And my mother was a physio who went to Bougainville and Lae and Darwin, trying to help put together the diggers of those campaigns. And Dad landed at Finchhaven and Dumpu. But the one that I've written about is Kokoda, particularly Kokoda, because again it is underdone by our fellow Australians in their knowledge of what happened. It is simply extraordinary to me that the same Australians who stopped the Germans in the deserts of the Middle East, nobody could stop them. The Australians stopped them. First on the 13th of April 1941, which was the first time Rommel attacked the perimeter of Tobruk, and as late as December in those battles, they'd stopped them 4 times. And then the Battle of El Alamein, where the Australians again were a huge part of that battle. But it is simply extraordinary to me that the same Australians who'd done so extraordinarily well to be the first to stop the Germans, then go to the jungles of New Guinea and stop the Japanese. Had gone Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Thailand, or Siam as it then was, all the way through. Nobody had stopped them till they got to these Australians at Milne Bay and Kokoda. And my favourite story out of Kokoda is one of the things I've learned over the years is to try to focus on the soldiers rather than the generals or the politicians, even as much as I love Curtin. And one story I forgot to tell about Curtin is that when the Australians were coming back across the Indian Ocean, at one point his driver turned up at the lodge at midnight for some reason, looking, and he had a message to come. And as he stops the car outside the lodge, he's just about to go in, and he can see a ghostly figure in the gardens of the lodge, and he looks closer, and it's a very wan-looking John Curtin. And he says, "Prime Minister?" And he says, "Yes." So why are you awake? And Curtin had said, "How can I sleep with so many of our men out on the Indian Ocean?" And it was, in fact, Darren mentioned the death of Curtin, which I'll just jump forward to in July. Was it 44 or 45? 45. And I think, I'll stand to be corrected, no doubt an eminent historian will correct me, but I think his name was Arthur Clark. He might have been his driver or his chief of staff. Curtin's dying, and he goes to the lodge, and there is Curtin on his deathbed in what is effectively a coma. And Curtin comes out of his coma, and he sees him, and he says, Did Fitzroy win today? And Clark says, "Yes, sir, Fitzroy won today." And he dies. And Fitzroy hadn't won that day. Fitzroy never won. But it was the right thing to do to farewell the Prime Minister. But the story I love, and again I can't do justice to it, but Dad taught us, all of his children, a wonderful editorial that was done in the New York Times after the fall of Dunkirk, after the evacuation of Dunkirk. And it was about, I can't recite it, I used to be able to recite it, but it was basically about how the glory of what happened at Dunkirk was the common man of the free countries rising from mine, from beach, from farmland, to take arms for the forces of liberty and to take on the German army. And the wonder of the battle for Australia from Milne Bay and Kokoda was men and women from all walks of life with all these different skills coming together. And they hadn't been trained for 10 years, but they helped each other, they were united, they were combined. And the exemplar of this common man rising and doing his duty, for me his name was Joe Dawson. And Joe was 19 years old and he was a member of the 39th Battalion, the mighty 39th Battalion, and they were militia. And part of joining the militia was, when they joined, it was you won't serve overseas, but you'll be defending the Australian homeland. And the Australians then changed the law, the Parliament changed the law to say, well, New Guinea's now a territory, so that includes New Guinea. And on this wet Wednesday night in February of 42, Joe answers the door at his home, in Fitzroy in fact, and there's the cable boy saying, 39th Battalion's been called up. Tomorrow night, you've got to be at 7 p.m. at Flinders Street Station. There'll be a train waiting for you to take you to Sydney, where a ship will be waiting to take you to New Guinea. And Joe, the following night, is in the arms of his at Flinders Street Station, and he's hugging and embracing the love of his life, sweet Eales. And they're crying and they're declaring their undying love. And the company sergeant major, company, fall in. He's got to extricate himself. Joe, weeping, extricates himself. Eales gives him a present, says, open this and think of me when you're in New Guinea. And he gets on the train, he opens the window, he kisses her, the conductor's whistle blows, and the train just pulls away in that jerky motion the trains are wont to do, and he puts his little head out, and Eales on the platform's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The train goes round the corner, she disappears, he slumps back, he's feeling as weak and as vulnerable as ever he's felt in his life. And he remembers the present that Eales had given him. She'd been going to give it to him for Christmas, but she's given it to him early. He opens it up and out tumbles a silver watch, and he turns the watch over, and on the back it says, to Joe, for all time, love, Eales. He puts it on, he immediately feels stronger, because whatever else happens, he knows he has the love of a good woman. They get to Sydney, up at Central Station. They march down Elizabeth, right on William, left on Crown. They get down to the Finger Wharf, and there is the Aquitania, a cruiser but now a troop ship. Joe told me that it was so heavily laden that when he put his kit down on his bunk and looks out through the porthole window, there's a big Sydney leather jacket looking back at him, well below the Plimsoll line. And they get to New Guinea, they get to Port Moresby, they get to the Kokoda track, the Japanese land, I think it's the 21st of July 1942, up around Boona and Gona on the north coast of New Guinea, and they start down the Kokoda track. All that Australia's got to stop them, to slow them down in the first instance, is C Company of the 39th Battalion, including Joe Dawson. They meet at the Battle of Isharava, and the job of the 39th Battalion is to hold them up, hold them as long as you can until the men from the AIF, I think it was the 2nd 14th Battalion, 2nd 16th, 2nd 17th, could reach them in time to join the battle. They fight like cats in a sack for 72 hours. Nearing the end of the battle, the shell from the Japanese mountain gun comes, lands in the jungle, blows Joe back. And Joe did what he always did, what they all did up there when something like that happens. He came to and he checks himself. Have I got a left leg? Good, intact. Right leg, good. Abdomen and chest is dry. I haven't taken a death wound like that. I've got my right arm, I've got my noggin. Left. Where is the silver watch? He cannot find the silver watch, and he scrabbles around on the jungle floor before he's dragged away, and takes the regimental aid post. He's put back together, and he fights the next 3 years of that war. And by Joe's count, nearly died 10 times. I think it was 6 times from malaria, twice from bullets, twice from shrapnel. But he sails through the heads of Sydney Harbour. I think it's 23rd of October 1945. They come into the Finger Wharf. At the bottom of the gangplank is Eales, who's come up from Melbourne, waiting for him. They marry within 48 hours. They live happily ever after, have 2 fine daughters, and settle up in Foster on the north coast. And my book was brought out, I think, in June of 2003, launched by Bob Carr down there at Woolloomooloo. Joe Dawson was there. I think it was the first Labor politician he'd ever met in his life. First time he'd ever been in a room with anybody that voted Labor, apart from his daughters. But Joe was there, and Bob Carr gave this great speech. Kokoda was launched. And 6 weeks later, the phone rings up in their home in Foster. Joe picks it up, and it's the gravelly voice of a very old man, and he says, "Your name, Joe Dawson?" Joe says, "Yeah." He says, "You're the Joe Dawson in FitzSimons' book on Kokoda?" Joe says, "Yeah." He says, "My name's Bill Carruthers. I fought with the 2nd 16th Battalion, Battle of Isharava, and I found a watch." 2 days later, ding dong, Elaine, his wife of 62 years, opens the door, and there is the little bloke from DHL. She signs for it, takes it inside, opens it up, out tumbles the silver watch. She turns it over, on the back it says, "To Joe, for all time. Love, Elaine." And Joe had just come back from abdominal surgery at the hospital, and he put it on. He was feeling weak, he was feeling vulnerable. He put it on. He immediately felt stronger. Whatever else, he had the love of a good woman. And we go forward to 2012, 5th of June, in the hospice at Tuncurry, an old man lying, dying, 95 years old, 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's breathing his last breaths, and his wife of 72 years by that stage is holding his hand, and on his wrist the silver watch. Vale Joe Dawson. And one of the regrets of my life, he had a mass. Is it a requiem mass when they serious farewells of serious people? And I went to the funeral up at Port Macquarie, and I got to there, and then I went to the cemetery, and there were 8 men meant to carry the coffin, and the 8th one was late. And the family said to me, "Would you carry it, Peter?" And I just was leaning down to grip it when the taxi turned up and the 8th man arrived. And on my own deathbed, I'll have that as a haunting memory of something I wish that I'd been able to do. I'm nearly done, but just to say that I know that the Thai-Burma Railway is not a part of the Battle of Australia, but just because it's in my head and I've just been filled with it, and it displayed exactly the same values that I've been talking about, that as Keating talked about, the virtues of what happened, the extraordinary stuff of what happened at Kokoda, and you all know the story of him kissing the ground at Kokoda, and I think that was 92. And Keating gave these words. He said, "The Australians who served here in Papua New Guinea fought and died not in defence of the old world, but the new world, their world. They died in defence of Australia and the civilisation and values which had grown up there. That is why it might be said that for Australians, the battles in Papua New Guinea were the most important ever fought, and not to be celebrated for the victories alone, or commemorated for those that lost, but for those values." And that's what I most love about what you're doing here to commemorate the battle for Australia, Australian independence, Australian identity, triumph through the embrace of Australian values. And again, I think it's lost to many what happened on the Thai-Burma Railway, but essentially the Weary Dunlop that I've written about, Dunlop Force they were called, they were part of the 7th Division. They were insanely landed on the north coast of Java. They were captured very shortly thereafter to become prisoners of war. They were sent to the Thai-Burma Railway as the Japanese, who'd been thwarted by the particularly American naval battles. Instead of sending their ships, their supplies round to Burma by sea, they wanted to do it by rail. The Australians were told, you're going to have to build it together with the British POWs, Dutch POWs, American POWs, and most particularly forced Asian labour. I mean, we lost 3,000 men there. The coolies, as they were called, lost tens and tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. But Tom Uren, the great Tom Uren, was one of those on the Thai-Burma Railway with Weary Dunlop, and he talked a lot about what Dunlop had done, because one thing that happened up on the Thai-Burma Railway, and as I say, I was up there last week at Hellfire Pass and Hintok Cutting, and I got there in the middle of the day and I wanted to walk basically the route that the diggers had walked, the POWs had walked to understand the barest beginnings of what it was like. And of course they told me to take water, and of course I knew better than them. I thought I'll be all right. And by the time I got to Hellfire, it was only a few kilometres, but it was extraordinary to me to be at Hellfire Pass, to have the heat from above, reflected from below and reflected from the walls. And when they were at that camp, they were starving. Our guys, our blokes, were starving. They were not given enough rations to live. They were well up in the mountains. It was difficult for the Japanese to get the supplies to them, and by the end of it, they started out on 20 ounces of rice a day. By the end of it, they were being fed 4 ounces of rice a day. And Weary Dunlop has one that in negotiations with the Japanese had insisted that the Japanese observe the Geneva Convention, and for forced labour that they be given a nominal salary. And part of it came down to, I've been trying to work out the currencies, but basically it came down to officers would get 5 shillings a day and the soldiers would get a shilling a day. Weary Dunlop was the one who'd said to his fellow officers, all of us officers, all the money will go into a common pool so we can buy food from the villagers and the traders. Some of Weary's fellow officers, a couple of them in particular, said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to build up our money so that when we get back, we've got some money to start again back in Australia. Weary Dunlop said, you're not hearing me, you're not listening to me. And he was 6'4". 16th game of rugby he ever played was for the Wallabies. And he said, we'll all put him in. And so they did. Weary had these values of egalitarianism. And Tom Uren, who became a great parliamentarian, I think he was there for about 35 years, and in his maiden speech in 1959 he talked about the Australians on the Thai-Burma Railway were on one side of a river, stroke creek, and the Brits were on the other, and said when cholera hit, he said on our side everything was shared, everything was equal. And he said they watched as the Brits, they got the best, the officers got the best tents, they got the best food and they got the best medical care. In Tom's maiden speech he said they arrived with 600 in 6 weeks later there were only 50 of them left. Now I've looked into that, I think that's a little bit embellished. But the point was that again, those Australians under Weary Dunlop, those Australians that fought in the battle for Australia, there's so much to be proud of, not just in their daring do, their military valour, but for the values that they embraced. Something that I've noticed after many years of telling stories in public, when I find myself starting to ramble, I like to do what the Americans did in Vietnam. I declare victory and leave. Thank you.
As we can bring our proceedings to a close, could I do 2 things? The first one is to invite the Reverend Geoffrey Usher, the official chaplain to the Battle for Australia Association, and then I'll follow that with calling upon Major Eileen Henderson.
We've gathered for the annual oration of the BFA Association. For Peter's great stories of hardship and glory, we offer a grateful ovation.
We'll conclude our proceedings with the Ode of Remembrance, which will be recited by Major Eileen Henderson, President of the Royal Australian Army Nurses Corps, never retired, Nurses Corps Association. But I think also just to remark that amongst our gathering today, there are descendants here of that service and sacrifice, and particularly representatives of the various divisions in wartime. But we can't neglect to mention that amongst that sacrifice in 42 was the Banker Island massacre, where 21 nurses were to lose their life. And that's why we have a tradition of asking Eileen to recite the ode for us as we come to a conclusion. And I'd invite you to stand if you're able to. And we'll also pause for silence after the ode of remembrance. Eileen will conclude it at an appropriate point. But I encourage you to just remember all of those stories that we've heard today, the sacrifices within your own family, perhaps, and amongst your friends and neighbours. And we recall the bravery and selflessness of all those who served, the suffering of those who lost loved ones, and we give thanks for these sacrifices and that our nation, including the territory of Papua New Guinea, prevailed in the battle for Australia. Eileen?
Yeah. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. Please take a seat, everyone. Thank you, Eileen, and thank you once again, everyone, for being with us today.